Okay, so Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. As we were, of course, we're going to be, inshallah, covering the tafsir, but there's one thing that we were just having a conversation about, which is what makes something halal, haram. How do we understand, for example, fi sabilillah, is that including paying zakat to the masajid? Is this including paying for the students that are talabat ilm perhaps, or perhaps right now, CARE, I guess, was calling for the masajid to collaborate together in funding and also donating for five different fields: journalism, law, political science, and just different areas that have, I guess, an influence in the policy making. And then if we were to have every single masjid basically fund or pay the scholarship on behalf of five, let's say, smart students that will start going into these different fields, then what we're going to be having is a whole group, perhaps 20,000 students going in all these fields, and then later we'll be expediting the change within the society. I said there's absolutely no objection to this, except we need to make sure that the students are also getting along with this education, that they would also have the foundation to be defenders of Islam. And because we're getting a lot of students go into these fields, well, I don't want to say a lot of students going into these fields per se, but going into different fields of education. And we're seeing a lot of students on university campuses lose their dean on university campuses. And a lot of this was really a result of low levels of Islamic studies within Islamic schools, low levels of Islamic studies within the masajid. A lot of it is taught as if it was taught for young children and not really up to their age. In fact, I've seen masajid have young children act as TAs, but they're actually the teachers, and they themselves are at a level of perhaps level of elementary, literally elementary level. And this is important just to keep in order to pave the way to move forward and have these people work in favor of Islam. We need to make sure that they have Islam. Because in Arabic we say فاقد الشيء لا يعطيه. If you don't have something, then there's no way that you're going to give it. So in order to make sure that we are funding in the right place for the right cause, we need to make sure that we're also um, letting those masajid build that foundation. There's another thing, a question about, well, it's a little irrelevant, but how do we understand if it's permissible to donate zakah for such a cause? And I would like to just explain one piece of thing that will help us understand, I guess, something that will will have many ways, but ways in directing us. Um, I like the comment, Noura. Both your strategy and theirs put together are the best. Absolutely, absolutely. So this is not at all saying that their strategy is a wrong strategy. I absolutely agree with their strategy. Okay. There is what makes something as sahih. This is rather in usul al-fiqh. The Hanafi definition is ما كان صحيحا بأصله ووصفه. ما كان صحيحا بأصله ووصفه. So what does that mean? In order to have something be considered as valid, it has to have two things. One, that the foundation itself is going in accordance with what the text had defined is considered as, hey, this is what makes this this pillar, or what makes a complete pillar, etc. And then the details. What are the details? When we're looking at the details, we're looking at things usually not necessarily intrinsic to the actual pillar, but it's more of a detail that's outside of the pillar. So let's give an example. When we're talking about a person, for example, going to pray, and this person is one, they've got the sincerity in place. Two, this person has their tahara, complete tahara, beautiful tahara. Three, this person is facing the Qibla. Four, this person is praying on the right grounds, but there was one problem. The problem is the clothes that they are wearing are actually stolen clothes. Okay. Is this person's salah valid or not? So then you'll have scholars debate the parameters of this act on whether it is within the foundation or whether it's in the detail that it is somewhat irrelevant to the foundation. Therefore, the act itself is valid. Salah in this case, for example, that's going to be the first opinion. The first opinion is going to say, well, this is a detail, this is irrelevant to the actual prayer. Therefore, the salah itself is valid and the person is at sin for, I guess, wearing these stolen clothes. The second opinion would say, well, wait a minute, how is this irrelevant to what the person is doing? Because here we go, this person right there praying, and this person is, of course, if we're talking about part of the conditions for a valid prayer, or at least for part of the conditions for a valid prayer is basically to dress modestly. This person is not dressing from halal clothes, then this portion of exactly like you would say modesty and immodesty, well, whether we're speaking about modesty or whether we're speaking about haram attire, this would be within the parameter of foundation. So you could see, and you could see whether we're speaking about the rituals. Let's give another example. Let's say somebody wanted to go to Hajj. They did their ihram, they went to the right miqat, they did their arkan, tawaf, sa'i, everything was done right. But there was one problem. This person's money was actually haram money. Are we going to consider that this person's Hajj is invalid, or is this person's Hajj valid? How are we going to look at it? Well, then they'll debate whether this is part of the foundation. So the first opinion will say, well, in order to consider doing Hajj, you've got two different foundations. Yes, there's the physical side of that foundation, and there's the other part. Well, just by going there and attending physically, it doesn't mean that the Hajj actually exists. And it wouldn't exist until you actually had money invested in it. So some scholars looked at Hajj, for example, to be one, physical, and two, financial as well. Therefore, if any of these two are basically invalid, then they considered that, hey, this is actually going within the parameters of foundation, then therefore this is invalid. Okay, that's the first opinion. The second opinion, they said, no, the foundation of Hajj is basically, hey, what is Hajj itself? Meaning the person going to the miqat, wearing the ihram, doing the manasik, etc., doing the different rituals, that's all that matters. But the person, this is a detail, then the person and what they had done in order to get this money is going to be considered as a detail and not part of the foundation, and therefore regarded that that person is at sin, but the actual Hajj is right. That's the same thing when we're talking about foundation and details and when we're speaking about perhaps transactions. what does that look like? So when we're talking about transactions, well, it's not limited. Some scholars didn't limit transactions to, I guess, trade and exchanging money, but some of them had expanded it to no, anything that is of a contract where it facilitates people's, I guess, relationship, facilitates people's I guess, service to one another in different ways, whether we're speaking about services, exchanging services, or whether we're speaking about marriage as well. So then they also went into, depending on the situation, they also went into details of how we understand whether this is a foundation or whether this is a detail. Are we just talking about marriage? Are we just talking about transactions? And you want to keep in mind that when you are looking at transactions, to what extent um, does someone's consent really get into the foundation and is part of the foundation? Well, you want to keep in mind that in Islam, consent is not put as in a place of sanctity, in the same magnitude that the West would consider consent to be of importance, because your consent would be considered in certain contracts and not in all contracts when this is relating to your right. But sometimes your consent does not really matter because it's not part of the foundation. Let's give an example. Let's say, hey, we wanted to make I don't know, someone wanted to borrow money, and then this person said, hey, pay me back on Tuesday, for example. And then this person wasn't able to pay it on Tuesday. And he said, it's okay, don't worry. I won't be able to pay it on Tuesday, but I understand you're going to ask for an interest. I'm okay with that. I'll pay the interest. Is that going to be considered valid? The answer is no, because there are certain contracts that the person's consent does not act whatsoever as a pillar, and therefore their consent does not make a difference. And in fact, it would be haram to even say and offer that you are consenting to something that is haram, because it's accepting a haram contract. So there are certain contracts where perhaps consent is considered, and other contracts where it is irrelevant. Let's just give another example. You know, women would come to me and say, my husband is accepting that I would do such and such. And I would say, well, sorry, but your husband's consent is irrelevant, because this is a border of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is irrelevant to his rights. But he's asking me to do this, and I'm here, or wanting me to do this, but I know it's haram, but he's consenting. I'd say, wait a minute. If it's haram, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's consent, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's approval of something goes beyond every single person's consent. So his consent is irrelevant, and this detail is irrelevant to the actual foundation. Let's give an example. There are certain things that just consenting to it is irrelevant when we're speaking about criminal law. As an example, let's say, well, let me, I guess, give you that story. A man commits zina, and then his father basically hears that his son was going to get the punishment of 100 flogs, plus he was going to get exiled for a whole year. But the man wanted, the father, that is, wanted to pay a ransom and free his son from the corporal punishment and also from getting exiled. So he offered 100 sheep, well, 100 heads of sheep. The Prophet ﷺ said, well, your son is going to get flogged and going to get exiled, and the sheep are going to get returned to you. In other words, this is not at all acceptable. So the scholars can say, explain this one, that when we're speaking about zina, for example, that's a physical sin, And that's why Islam had presented a corporal punishment to fix this physical sin. Then in that situation, this monetary or this somehow ransom in I guess in place of that zina is going to be considered, of course, not acceptable, because even if the government was going to consent to it, this basically has a foundation mentioned within the text to tell us that we cannot accept any ransom for any crime that someone had committed. Well, let's just assume that this person stole and wanted to pay a ransom in order to, I guess, defend himself, protect himself from a corporal punishment. Well, we would still not accept it because the Prophet ﷺ had told the Sahabi when he wanted to pay the ransom. Well, if you wanted to, when that was Safwan ibn Umayyah, when that man had stolen his cloak, and it was definitely a very rich cloak because Safwan ibn Umayyah was considered, hey, he was a CEO for a weapon company. So yes, you couldn't mess with that person, and was extremely rich to the point that even the Prophet ﷺ during the Battle of Hunain had actually borrowed from him, or at least did, I guess, a business contract, and that the Prophet ﷺ would pay him later. Safwan ibn Umar was tremendously rich. So he was sleeping in the masjid. A man comes over, while he was sleeping, steals his expensive coat, and then eventually this person, the perpetrator, was found. And then Safwan ibn Umayyah sees that the Prophet ﷺ was going to apply the law of punishment on him, but then he had already filed, let's call it, filed, an official report, and right now it's in the government's hands. So then Safwan ibn Umayyah goes to the Prophet ﷺ and said, "You're going to amputate his hand for this coat? That's okay. I'm okay with it. You know what? I don't need him to get amputated for my coat. That I'm consenting." So the Prophet ﷺ said, "Well, if you would have wanted to, in other words, forgive this person, or you wanted to let this person go, that should have done before that is filing the report at the government's office. Now that you had filed the report at the government's office, now it is the government issue to look into the case and to see whether there was a crime or not. And it's not an issue of whether you consent to it and what you think should be done, because now it's a crime that the government is right now taking in the responsibility to scrutinize right now, and your consent is going to be irrelevant to how we deal with this crime. So I want you to look into, understanding, the different foundations and the different details and how scholars might debate. Of course, well, at least with the with the transaction laws and etc. They'll, they're more, I guess, the debate, I would say, is wider, simply because we're not only discussing consent, but we're discussing other areas, other pillars within the foundation. How do we see that? Okay. In terms of certain details or certain foundations, whether it is within the perimeter of foundation, whether it is outside, that's when they'll many times go into these debates on whether it is within the perimeter of foundation or the perimeter of detail, and how does that unfold in making this perhaps prayer or this action valid or invalid, or is the person accountable, or is the person held accountable for it, and what fixes all of this? So I just wanted to mention this one. I know it's a little irrelevant to what we're talking about, but yeah, just wanted to keep note of it. Okay, so yesterday we were talking about the tafsir for this surah. وَلَا تَجِدَنَّ Let's go look at the ayah. And this is the ayah. لا تجدن أشد الناس عداوة للذين آمنوا اليهود والذين أشركوا. That you will find the most people to be in animosity, or the most people to be as enemies for the believers are basically the Jews and those that are considered ashraku, to mean those that are associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you will find those that are aqrabahum, that superlative word, to mean closer in their affection, in their love, in their emotions for the believers, the ones that said that they are, or inna nasara, the ones that had said we are Christian. And we went in detail where does the word Nasara really come from? Is that equivalent to the word Christian? How do we understand that? For many of them are qissisina wa ruhbana. So we talked about the reason for the revelation for this ayah, and we went into the story of Najashi when the Muslims had went to al-Hijrah, when the Muslims had went to doing a migration to Medina, and we went into speaking about Askhama, which is in Najashi, and which Najashi, and all of that, and what that name is. And there was one particular figure, Amr ibn Umayyah al-Damri. I really wanted to speak some of the things about Amr ibn Umayyah al-Damri. For a number of different reasons. Let's look at that Sahabi, Amr ibn Umayyah al-Damri, and just learn just a couple of things. Well, why did the Prophet ﷺ choose him out of all the Sahaba? And you could see, let's see, شهد مع المشركين بدرا وأحدا. So here's one point, that شهد مع المشركين بدرا وأحدا. In other words, he was with the mushrikeen during Badr and Uhud. Okay. The Prophet ﷺ sent him later, when he had become Muslim, to lead a whole army himself. And the Prophet ﷺ sent him to Najashi. We already know that he also fought with the Prophet ﷺ in certain battles. He was known to being a very courageous person, a person that would not step back, a very strong person. So just just a couple notes, I guess, about him. And let's see, I'm just trying to just look into, I guess, a couple things for us to just learn about Amr ibn Umayyah al-Damri. Let's look into Wikipedia, because it will give me, at least I know it's not a valid resource. Let's see, he died 60-year Hijrah. I just knew that. I would assume it's actually right. And Amr ibn Umayyah al-Damri, just seeing some things about him, at least the date of wafa. Okay, let's continue right there. We talked about the story when, of course, Najashi had become Muslim, and I guess some of those that were with him. And when we say some of those that were with him, we're talking about certainly the priests that were with him. We also talked about um, the story of the Christians from Najran. That, of course, we're speaking about the Christians from Najran, meaning area of Syria and some areas in Jordan as well. They're considered from Najran, or at least some Christians from there. And we said right there, قيل إن جعفر وأصحابه قدم على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في 70 رجلا عليهم ثياب الصوف. I want you to look at this one. In لغة عربية, when you say قال, this is more of a word that is giving me it's giving me an affirmation that this person, this is what he had said. But when you say قيل, it is considered in لغة عربية as a form of تضعيف. A form of تضعيف. What is تضعيف? تضعيف is an indication that there is something rather not authentic in this, that there's perhaps something that is known to the author or to the person that is saying it that he's in doubt or skeptic about some pieces of information, or at least the validity of this information. So when he uses qila, this is in order to say, well, I don't really have the evidence to support, to affirm this piece of information, but it was said, and therefore this way, this method of speaking about this note is indicating that it doesn't really have any evidence to validate this information. And he said that Ja'far and his friends. So we're talking who are Ja'far's friends? So Ja'far is Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin, and his friends are basically going to be uh, the ones that migrated to Al-Habasha, to Abyssinia. And they came to the Prophet ﷺ with 70 men. They were dressed in wool, and 62 of them were actually from Abyssinia. Eight were from Ahl Shem, from the Levant. So Ahl Shem, the Levant would be Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. That would be considered Bilad Shem. And he said that they were Buhayrat. So what is Buhayrat right there? And he said, well, he just wanted to talk about how it's mentioned, but the Buhayra Rahib, which basically was a priest, and of course some of those names that he had mentioned, and that the Prophet ﷺ had read Surah Yasin on them, and they all started crying when they had heard, or weeping when they heard the ayat, and they said, "We never heard of such a thing get revealed onto Prophet Isa alayhi salam." So when you look at that, you could see that he had said qila in a way where is it really authentic? Where does this resource come from? You could see that whole story, one thing to mention, the whole story of about this priest named Bahira is actually not authentic. And just a note, although the story, let me, I guess, say the story. The story goes as follows: that Abu Talib was going to Bilad al-Sham, to the Levant, and accompanying him was the Prophet ﷺ and some other people as well. The other people were Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and Bilal ibn Rabah, and they were going to the Levant, and in the middle of the way, there's this priest. His name is Bahira. He looks at the Prophet ﷺ, who was still, I guess, in his early teenage or a young boy, and he basically comments to his uncle and says, "You got to watch out for this boy, because one day the Jews will attempt to kill him, and he's going to be something of a big magnificence." Although the story sounds very miraculous, it's sounding very beautiful, but the story is actually not mentioned in the most important books of Sirah. And neither is it making sense that even the characters within the story are actually, you're taking things outside of chronology and including it there, and then you're mixing a whole story. So when you're talking about Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, we don't know that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had went with the Prophet ﷺ to Bilad al-Sham from the first place. Two, Bilal ibn Rabah. Bilal ibn Rabah was a slave for Umayyah ibn Khalaf. Umayyah was not necessarily going into the trade. Perhaps he was, but does that mean, you're putting these characters that outside of the chronology, outside of the context, coming from a different context and putting it in a different context? And certainly the scholars actually talked about the chain of narration for this story. And then later on, the Orientalists said, well, it's this person that was teaching Muhammad ibn Abdullah, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Quran. It's that particular priest that he had met some while back, and he was the one that was giving him this information. So that's when the Quran commented and basically said, لِسَانُ الَّذِي يَلْحُدُونَ إِلَيْهِ أَعْجَمِيٌّ. The person that they were insinuating to teach the Prophet ﷺ, whether it's Bahira or some other priest, they said, well, he's the person that is Kuffar Quraysh. They're saying that the Prophet ﷺ was coming with the words of the Quran from some priest that was a Christian priest, and the Quran responded and said, well, the person that you guys are referring to is not even Arab. He doesn't even know how to speak Arabic. So how is it that he was going to give him this information or even the ability to read Quran and say such eloquent words that even you, the most eloquent Arab, could not even come forward to make something similar in its eloquence whatsoever? How is it that this person that is not Arab going to be coming forward with such words? That's impossible. That's a discrepancy. That's contradicting yourself. And certainly, you're just confusing all the matter. So when you're looking at Bahira Rahib mentioned in the story, that's probably one main reason why Al-Qurtubi had just, I guess, wanted to somehow show his skepticism about the validity of the story by saying qila. It was said, I'm just laying it out there, but I don't really think that it's valid. That's exactly what you would gain out of the word qila when scholars of hadith or scholars of tafsir would use that terminology. That's to indicate that they are not finding it valid. Okay, let's see. When we're speaking about, of course, لا تجدن أشد الناس عداوة الذين آمنوا or الذين آمنوا اليهود والذين أشركوا, that this ayah you could see يعني وفد النجاشي وكانوا أصحاب الصوامع. What is a صوامع? So الصوامع is basically a صومعة. That's the singular form of it. What is a Soma? Soma is a monastery. So the group that was coming from Abyssinia, it doesn't have to be in Najashi himself, but there was a group from Abyssinia. Now that we could see that there was a note of that there was a group coming from Abyssinia, and a number of them were actually monks. So they weren't all priests. Well, what's the difference between a priest and a monk? So a priest is a person that was assigned by the Pope himself or by, I guess, the religious institution to, I guess, be qualified in their education and be qualified as designated within, I guess, this institution to be in the field or in the position of a priest. Of course, Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity and even Protestant and their orientation, or at least what they would regard as a person that qualifies to be a priest, it really differs. So Catholicism is completely different. In Catholicism, for a person to be a priest, that's going to be more of orientation or well, it depends on whether the person is a bishop or an archbishop or etc. So in that situation, that would be assigned by the Pope and other priests in order to put them in that level, or to consider them that they had passed a certain level of education, passed a certain level of commitment to the church, and therefore they could be assigned to be within that area. In terms of Orthodox, some of it is similar, but in terms of Protestant, it's completely not that way. The Protestants, they had, I guess, the whole area of, I guess, abandoning or not being, not, well, so the whole area of celibacy was not included whatsoever. And, it was from the time of the Martin Luther, and certainly Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., Martin Luther, the German guy, and how they would approach the text and what defines text and what defines good behavior and how we would basically see the word of God and read the word of God and apply it. You could see the same thing with Eastern Jews, Eastern Christians. The way that they would relate to the text is completely different than the way the Western Christians would relate with the text, and in particular the Protestants. And that's why you would see, for example, the Maroon in in Lebanon, for example, they would have, or even the Coptics in Egypt, they would have their interpretation and their, I guess, their religious practices are different than the Western Christians. Although right now there's, I guess, some political, let's call it that way, some political alliances coming from a different corner, but it's, just mention this piece of it. And certainly when we're speaking about a monk, it's different than a priest because a monk would be a person that didn't necessarily go through the path of, that being, I guess, oriented within a religious position, but no, it was a personal choice to ostracize oneself from life, from dunya, and to devote a person's life to Christ himself or devote himself to God, etc. So they would, I guess, disassociate themselves from anything relating to dunya. They could have had a past where they were probably married, had children, and lived just a normal life like everyone else. But then all of a sudden, they decided that they wanted to separate themselves and just orient themselves or somehow uh, just live a life away from dunya. So those would be the ones ashab al-sawama. Ashab al-sawama, until the time of today, believe it or not, there are some of those that would really live in that form of living in a monastery, but that form of life away from dunya, perhaps living on just pieces of dunya, just doing their prayers in this sawma, in this monastery, and they don't have phones. They may have sources of water. Some might actually just use perhaps um, just water that's coming from the earth. So they'll choose to live in faraway caves away from people, and just designate themselves and be devout to God, to Christ, and so forth. As Muslims, shouldn't we live this life? It sounds very attractive, very spiritual. Um, is this something that Islam whatsoever recommends that we would do in order to gain and somehow increase in our spirituality? So, in Islam, this type of disassociating yourself away from dunya is actually hated. That's why when the three men had come to Sayyidah Aisha and they basically were asking and inquiring about the Prophet ﷺ's way of worship, and the first one said, well, I pray all night and um, and I would never sleep throughout the night. The second one said, I fast every single day and I would never break my fast. The third one said, I don't get married and don't approach women. In other words, basically dismissing all the sexual desire and basically just making myself just devout to God Almighty. And when they had come to the Prophet ﷺ, come to Sayyidah Aisha, uh, and inquiring, كأنهم تقالوها, they consider, oh, that's not much. You know, they were considering it as not a big deal. Hey, we're presenting something even better. So that's when the Prophet ﷺ comes back home and he hears of their conversation, and he said, you had said one, two, three, in regards to the lifestyle that you're living. So the Prophet ﷺ said, I get married to women and um, I get married to women and pray and sleep, and I would also eat and drink and I would fast. In other words, it's not an issue of somehow mortifying the body and mortifying its needs, but he said, فَمَنْ رَغِبَ عَنْ سُنَّتِي فَلَيْسَ مِنِّي. Anybody that goes and denies or lives a lifestyle away from my way of basically sunnah, the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him the guidance, basically legislating order in natural order. Whoever goes away from the order that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed in the revelation is basically not part of minni, meaning not following the inspiration of Islam that was basically inspired to the Prophet ﷺ, by Jibril alayhi salam. So just seeing that one, ostracizing oneself away from dunya, living in perhaps caves, but we would know that the Prophet ﷺ did mention that at the end of times, that people, the mu'mineen, their souls would basically be I guess in other words, they would be decreed to death. They would be running away in caves. And why would they be there? They would be away from the society. That's when uh, the fitna is so rampant, there's no room to correct such a fitna. So they would basically run away from the cities to protect themselves, to protect their children from the fitna, because it had basically become so rampant. It was something that you couldn't really protect yourself and protect your children, so they would go and live away in caves. So what does the society look like for these salihin to somehow only find caves? In other words, they're not putting their kids in universities, colleges. They're in these prestigious areas. They're right now trying to protect their children's deen. And yes, the society is probably working on, yeah, in order for you to be successful, this is what you need to do, and this is what you need to get, etc. But these people decided that they wanted to protect their children's deen away from this whole system of how the society was considering the definition of success to look like. So the Prophet ﷺ does mention in different ahadith that at the end of times, a person passing by a grave would basically envy the dead person because of the amount of fitna there will be. The zina would be so rampant that people are literally practicing zina on the streets. We're not talking about inappropriate videos here. We're actually talking about people literally practicing zina in the streets, and the best of these people would probably give an advice. Well, you could have just done it behind perhaps a building, and no one would say, that was the best. That was the best that he could probably give in terms of an advice. He just wanted him, just don't make it too public. That's okay. Commit zina, don't make it too public. Okay, that was the best out of all of them. You're looking at, if the best is one of the worst, what are we looking at? A situation where zina is everywhere. Homosexuality is also everywhere. You're speaking about people oppressing one another. You're speaking about riba everywhere. You're speaking about a society that knows no limit no limit to or to um, any haram act. You're speaking about a society that does not respect not the foundation of family, certainly not the sanctity of family, not the sanctity of wealth in the distribution, and not the sanctity of human life. Where killing, it is so rampant that the person would get killed and they have no clue on and why they got killed. They just got killed. You could see that crime is skyrocketing in such high rates that people are just killing one another left and right, and you don't even know why that person killed and why they got killed and what really happened. They don't even know any reason to it. But that's the kind of life that people will be living once you don't have the principle to determine determine where and what foundation and what resources you depend on to determine those principles, then you're really losing your parameters. You're losing all the parameters of what makes a principle, what makes and gives the protection. Remember that armor? What actually protects the person from such, I guess, a fitna that will be surrounding the community. Okay, let's see. Sa'id ibn Jubair. So is it then that before I jump into speaking about Sa'id ibn Jubair, is it then that we can say that once that fitna is to that extent, that we can say, yeah, that yes, the person can move out and actually live as monks? But we're not talking about living as monks where they're disassociating themselves from anything in dunya, meaning not getting married and such. But no, this person is going far away from the city to protect their children, protect themselves, at least in their deen. So they could be living away, but they're just doing so not because they wanted to disassociate themselves from dunya. They wanted to disassociate themselves from the fitna. And those are two different things. Okay. قال سعيد ibn Jubair. Sa'id ibn Jubair died 90, was killed actually. Well, he was actually by Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi. He was actually killed by him. He was 90, it was in 95 year Hijrah. And Sa'id ibn Jubair, Al-Hajjaj, basically wants to hear what he is saying and what his opinion in regards to his own position of governance. And Sa'id ibn Jubayr didn't hesitate to tell him that he was actually nothing but a person that is al-zalim, nothing but a person that is a tyrant. And that's when I guess Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, who was actually known to literally being a tyrant, to the point that many scholars had said that scholars had unanimously agreed that Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi is a fasiq. But you want to keep a note, Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi is rather very controversial because he was also one main leader, despite the fact that he had, I guess, committed a lot of crimes and abused his position of governance within Iraq. And it was the famous story when he basically sat on the minaret and started wanting to start his official governance position and just sat there on the chair. And I guess the people sitting in that and supposed to be listening to the oration, to that ceremony that he was about to deliver, he stayed for a long time just looking at people and just watching people. And that's when people, I guess, got bored of it and considered that, oh, this is nothing but a silly, stupid leader. We can get away with just starting to attack him. So some of them started throwing stones, kind of like, those naughty kids started throwing stones, making fun, giving these silly jokes and all of that. And that's when Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi had mentioned his famous oration, and he said, beginning his oration, إني أرى رؤوسا قد أينعت وحان قطافها. That's when he said his famous orientation. It's a metaphor, but he was very much known to what he was referring to. He said, I see that some heads had basically ripened and it was time to pick them. Huh, a metaphor where we know exactly what he means. So, Sir Thing basically had assassinated, killed a number of these people for not respecting his position. And then Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi was actually known to being the leader to put many in order. And it was a funny story that a man comes and he was actually known to having some, I guess, a problem with his speech. And Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, called him, hey, need to have a personal conversation with you. And in order to basically get him on track, and he was just sitting with Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, and Al-Hajjaj hears this man who was actually known to everyone in the city, that he wasn't of an eloquent person. He was a person that has a problem with his speech. He had a speech problem, etc. But then he spoke in such high eloquence. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, he said, Al-awaqib tusayyiru al-ayiyya khatiba. When they would know the consequence, yet the consequence could be severe. Even those that don't know how to fix their speech will learn how to fix their speech. Mhm. Just imagine that. Just imagine that he said, Al-awaqib tusayyiru al-ayiyya khatiba, the person that doesn't know how to talk, when he knows that there could be a big consequence, and put his life probably on the break of probably then he'll correct his speech and he'll learn how to correct his voice tone. He'll learn. And, my internet connection is not stable. Am I right?
Right. It's cutting out pretty bad.
Well, okay.
Inshallah, she'll be right back.
Or me better not. Anybody want to comment, Noura?
Now it's stable, alhamdulillah.
Oh, alhamdulillah. Okay, so now we're seeing, this is just some thing, but you want to keep in mind, Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, his cousin, when Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi heard that some Hindus had taken 100 women in captivity in India, that's when Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi sent his cousin, who was only 19 years old, Qutayba ibn Muslim al-Bahili. He uh, basically sent his cousin um, to go and set an army in order to free these 100 women from the Hindu captivism. Just see what he had done. So he basically funded this whole army that was going all the way. You're talking about going through Afghanistan, and in order to get to India, he didn't want to go through those mountains up there, so basically went through Sri Lanka. And then basically, you're talking about extreme intelligence. Like, okay, how are we going to get there? And went through Sri Lanka, and then in order to get to India, and then later on, he was actually the main figure to introduce Islam, and even not only free these women, but it was also making those Hindus even pay the jizya to the Muslim government, which basically is Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi. So when you're looking at Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, he was also the one to give order on letting his name was Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali, who, of course, the Quran didn't have these dots and these little harakat right there. It was basically by the order of Al-Hajjaj that he wanted something to distinguish between the ba, the ta, the noon, and of course those letters that probably have similarities. And in order to make sure that al-A'ajam, the non-Arab, are going to be capable of easily distinguishing those letters. So it was basically an order from Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Al-Hajjaj was not only giving the Ummah political advancement, but also educational advancement. So he's got a lot of good things that he had done, but of course we cannot forget whatsoever that when he had ordered the persecution of Sa'id ibn Jubayr, that Sa'id ibn Jubayr was actually haunting him in his dreams, and eventually he was basically feeling guilty that he had basically persecuted Sa'id ibn Jubayr. So, okay, Sa'id ibn Jubayr, this great scholar, he said that for this group, at least, it was in Najashi and also the monks that were living there, they were the ones that this ayah was referring to. Let's look at Muqatil and al-Kalbi. He said there were 40 men from the area of Najran, the Christians of Najran, which, like we said, part of Syria and part of Jordan. Of course, it was predominantly Christian there. And he said 32 were from Abyssinia, and 8 were Rumiyun min Ahl Sham. I want you to look at the word Rumi. So the word Rumi was a word that defined the Byzantine Empire at the time, and to them, the Byzantine Empire, it was ruling parts of Syria, well, all of Syria, and parts of Lebanon, well, all of Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and parts of Egypt. You're looking at parts of Libya. You're looking at parts of Tunisia, etc. So that was the area of what they would consider Bilad al-Rum. Okay, that at the time was under the Byzantine Empire. And it wasn't until later that the Byzantine Empire, of course, split. And then, of course, later the Muslims defeated Bilad al-Rum. So what they considered as Rumi, who are the Rumi today? The Rum today are Europe. Rum today are Europe. So when the Prophet ﷺ would talk about Rum, he would talk about Europe. It is referring to Europe and not referring, so it's not a geographical area or a geographical classification, but this is actually a classification in terms of designation to the religion, their orientation towards Christianity. Okay, so right now, Rum are basically considered Europe, the US, Australia. Those would all be a Rum in what today is considered as the West. Okay, just to keep that in mind. The Arab used to call Rum Bani al-Asfar, the children or the people with the pale skin. And they had considered that their skin color, ironically. But it's so weird today that whiteness is during our times is actually a sign of advancement, a sign of superiority. But during that time, whiteness was considered as a sign of somehow not looking good, a sign that a person is not of a good position. So you would see the Arab actually also calling them Bani al-Asfar. They didn't call the Chinese Asfar, but they only called the Rum Asfar, even though the Chinese are also white. And certainly, when you were speaking about many Asians, the Kazakh, the Uzbek, they're white, but they didn't call them Asfar. But that's because they considered that these people were sick. I don't know. And it's really strange, but it's really strange how, the classifications and how the society would consider that group is sick. They're sick to the core, and
Can
they're
I ask
called.
you something?
Go
Sorry.
ahead, Noor.
I was just, can you tell us, if are there some hadith about, yani for like the West or the people of Rome, like coming to Islam, like hadith for the end of times?
There are actually a number of different hadith. If we're looking at, I guess, one particular hadith that right now is coming to me is when the Prophet ﷺ said that there's going to come a time where the Muslims would unite with Rome, and they would be fighting a third army. This third army, or at least the place for that battle, is going to be in Bilad al-Sham, in the Levant. Bilad al-Sham, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. That's where, let's call it the battlefield is. And the Muslims and the Rum would unite. And at one point, somebody from the Rum, after, of course, the Muslims, or that at least union, who's fighting a third army, who knows what that third army is, then, of course, that union together, they defeat this third army. But then all of a sudden, somebody, or is it the media, or what exactly happens? Somebody from the room would say the crusade had won. So then the Muslims, somebody from the Muslim army gets angry. It's like, wait a minute, did you just call it a crusade? This isn't a crusade war. We're not here. We weren't here to support a crusade war. In other words, there was some political, I guess, at that moment, some political controversy within this area, how to label this victory. Is it the arms of the Rum, or is it the Muslims that were actually fighting in body? What do we call this? And who's actually funding all this war, etc. But then, of course, the Muslims would get so angry, or this particular Muslim would get so angry and start attacking the Rumi. This person, the Rumi, gets killed, and then it becomes a battle between the Rum and the Muslims, where, well, on the grounds of Bilad al-Sham. Then, after being victorious against this third army, now we're seeing these two groups that were at one point a union to defeat this third army. They're now basically fighting each other. The West / Rum and the Muslims. It doesn't end there. A group of Muslims, they basically feel that this is a war that they could never be victorious in. So 1/3 of the army unites with Rum, 1/3 of the Muslim army. The Prophet ﷺ literally calls them munafiqeen. That third army goes and unites with the Rum and says, well, they would basically give themselves the narrative. This is a war that we cannot overcome, we cannot be victorious in. So the best thing to do is just basically join them. Then, of course, there are 2/3 that are, well, 2/3 that are left. The 2/3 they would continue to win, or at least to, fight in that battle. Then, of course, the Muslims, at least these 2/3, they would lose the battle. So another third is basically now starting to get convinced that perhaps that third that joined previously, the Rum, is probably right, that this battle is basically going to bring us more loss, because as Muslims, we probably don't have the military power, we probably don't have the political power, we probably don't have, I guess, the different means to make us victorious in this battle. So the best option that they would think is, well, is to join the non-Muslim / the Rumi, the Rumi army. So they would join the Rumi army. That is the second third. And only 1/3 is facing a whole union of Rum and 2/3 of the Muslim army that had already joined them. This 1/3 gets defeated, and then they would say, that's it. It's either going to be victory or a shahada. There's no giving up. So they would go into this, quote unquote, suicidal type of a, because if we're talking about a large group, we're talking about very heavily equipped, etc., then that's definitely going to be somewhat of a suicide. Once you say it's either we're going to be victorious or we're going to get killed and shahada, that's definitely like going into suicide. But they basically are described by the Prophet ﷺ that they would be the ones that are salihin. That's when they would be going into this battle. First day, second day, it takes a little longer than they had expected, but then who knows where they fighting guerrilla wars, what kind of wars, because definitely you're talking about the other Rum / hypocrite union is right now definitely overcoming the Muslims in number. And this 1/3 is a very small group. So what kind of a battle do they do at the end? We don't know. But the Prophet ﷺ said that they would be victorious. They would be victorious, defeat that hypocrite Rumi union. And that's when I guess they were really happy about their victory. But that's when Shaitan would call out that Ad-Dajjal is out. Ad-Dajjal is out. So they would send 10 men on horses. Horses? Why horses? Wait a minute. So why horses? What kind of weapons are they using? But the Prophet ﷺ said, I would know them by their names. I know those 10 horsemen, and they would go eastwards. Are they going towards Afghanistan? Are they going towards Iran? Where are they going? But they're going eastwards to verify whether the Dajjal is out or not. And that's when, sure thing, later and soon after all of this, the Dajjal comes out. So you could see. But there's one thing that we need to keep in mind, that when it comes to the chronology of the different ends of times and what happens first, what happens later, what, all of that, we don't really have in let's say one or any hadith that tells us that this is number one, this is number two. In other words, telling us about the actual chronology of how things happen. We don't really know the circumstances that would surround them. So when you look at, for example, another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, تفتح روما بالتكبير, that Roma, which basically is the Vatican, that it would be conquered by the Muslims بالتكبير, but by no war, no battle whatsoever. It would just be takbir. We're just doing the adhan, we're just doing takbir, and right there, the Vatican,
And we know
Rome,
for sure
Italy.
that's the Vatican?
Yes, we know for sure that that's the Vatican.
Okay, Jazakallah khair.
Yes, we know for sure that that's the Vatican. And that basically resembles as, let's call it the pillar, or at least the minaret for Catholicism. Not all Christians would basically consider that the Vatican is their place of sanctity and sanctuary place, because the Protestants don't consider that. But at the end is that, yes, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Tuftah Roma bitakbir," and we're talking about the Vatican, we're talking about Roma, Italy, etc. So we're talking about that area. So it doesn't have to be the Vatican itself, but we're talking about the Vatican, or at least what is considered as the foundation, the area of sanctity for the Christian army. Okay. So that's basically just different hadith foretelling us and give us the prophecy of what's going to happen. So if we're talking about the West, what are we looking at? How does this happen? When does it happen, etc.? Just guess to learn a couple lessons. Many times we could see certainly the political situation many times can be very murky, and then we're probably intimidated to join different groups and consider different collaborations. And if it's at the expense of our deen, that really would be exactly like those groups that united with the Western slash Rumi army and basically facing the Muslims, and only 1/3 stayed in, I guess, in opposition for all of this. But the Prophet ﷺ called the other 2/3 as hypocrite. They're munafiqeen, because they were giving themselves the just different justification. Oh, it's basically looking at the lesser evil. We're here trying to, trying to somehow be tolerant. We're trying to bring about, I guess, a safety to the Muslim blood. This 1/3, they're extreme. They're just too fanatic, and they'll give them different names. Oh, then they'll find so many different names to change the narrative of things. So, I'm just laying out some uh, Nura, you took me somewhere else. Okay, let's see. قتادة. Okay, 8 رومي من أهل الشام. Let's see قتادة. قتادة, and we talked about قتادة before. He said نزلت في ناس من أهل الكتاب كانوا على شريعة من الحق مما جاء به عيسى عليه السلام فلما بعث الله محمدا آمنوا به فأثنى الله عليهم. Who's Qatada? We talked about Qatada before, and he said he is one major scholar, and all scholars, those that would agree or disagree with his Qadar Aqidah, they all had taken him as one very important scholar. He was blind, but he was a person that was of a magnificent memory. So what did he say? He said, it was revealed in regards to a certain group of people from the people of the book. They were followers of Ash-Sharia min al-Haq. So they were basically following some traces of what was revealed onto Prophet Isa alayhi salam. And then when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu was sent down, they believed in him, and that's when this ayah was revealed, praising these people that had basically embraced the Prophet sallallahu ذلك بأن منهم قسيسين ورهبانا. And what is قسيسين? Well, the word قسيس, you could see that the root is qas and qasis, and qasis, is it a Arabi word or where is it coming from? So the word qasis is not actually a Arabi word. Here he said بلغة الروم because the Arab didn't speak their language. So to them, when we're speaking about Rum, they would consider, for example, the French as Rum, the Germans as Rum, and the British as Rum. They would consider all of them. So you could see when they would say usually بلغة الروم, they would usually refer to Latin. Okay. So they considered that that was probably Latin. In other words, it's not an Arabi word. Wait a minute, but I thought the Quran was revealed in Arabi. Why is it right there saying that it's not an Arabi word, but the Quran says, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا? Are there words in the Quran that are not necessarily Arabi? So the answer is, in linguistics, certain words and languages do borrow from one another. So whether we're speaking about certain words like mira, certain words like qasis, for example, and other words that might be used in the Quran where perhaps originally it was Amharic or maybe Ji'zi or maybe Hebrew, like the names Ibrahim, Musa, etc., that they're or Abraham. That's also another qira'ah. Where do these words come from? How were they Arabized, or are they considered Arabi, or how do we? So you want to keep in mind that the words themselves can actually be borrowed from other languages, but then they stay within at least they stay within that community, that's the origin or the etymology of it, but later the Arab themselves had adopted that particular word and just gave it a Arabi sense, but just like the word Najashi. Okay, for sure that An-Najashi in Amharic or perhaps in Ji'zi, that's probably not the way they pronounce the word. Okay. But the Arab, they didn't know how to say it in the Ji'zi language, or Ji'ziya language, or even in Amharic or whatever the language was. So they Arabized it in a certain way. And same thing, when you're talking about qissis, you might go to Latin and say, well, there's no qaf in Latin. So what is the basis of it? Where does this word actually come from? Same thing we're talking about Fir'aun. Ancient Egyptians, did they really use the word Fir'aun, or what did it really sound like? And what did the actual I guess the actual word, what did it sound like? So it's really important to just mention that yes, certain words were adopted from foreign languages, and very few, they're not too many, and were included in the Quran based on that particular terminology and what that particular group was basically understanding, and what I guess qasis, it would be a particular position in, I guess, the Christian in society. And this was basically to define that political slash perhaps religious position. Same thing when you're talking about Qarun. Was that his name or was that his position? Okay, Fir'aun, that wasn't his name for sure. His name was perhaps Tutankhamun, maybe? Or was it someone else? Which Fir'aun are we talking about? Because there's a Fir'aun that was the pharaoh that was born in that castle, and there was another pharaoh that was the Exodus pharaoh. So which pharaoh is it? Because remember, The pharaohs used to marry their own mothers, their own daughters. So you just want to keep that in mind. So, the way that they had split even that political I guess transition, or at least the governance itself, was completely different. But the Quran still called him Fir'aun, still called him Fir'aun. Was that a political position, like I said, or was that necessarily a Arabic word? For sure, it's not an Arabic word. For sure, it's not an Arabic word. For sure, the word qasis is not an Arabic word. For sure, there are certain words that are not originally Arabic, but the Quran adopted such words, and the Quran approving such words, that this is that identifying word for such a position. It basically was later Arabized and included in, let's say, the Arabic language, even though it wasn't actually originally going back to the Arabic resource. Okay, of course, that's why when you would see, for example, some of the scholars try to Arabize it, and I guess try to prove that the etymology is actually Arabic somehow. You had some scholars, they wanted to somehow prove that it goes to a Arabic etymology, and they said, well, what that means is that their voices would be heard reciting, I guess, their hymns and reciting their scripture at night. And تقصصت أصواتهم بالليل, that means I had heard it or sneaked in hearing it. And al-qas, that it was in namima, etc. But in the end, al-qas is basically the priest. It's I guess a religious position from the Christian, within the Christian community. They have a certain, I guess, position based on education, or based on, I guess, how within their community they would choose the priest and etc., regardless of whether we're speaking about Catholics or Protestants or even Orthodox, and the list goes on and on. Okay, so at the end, so regardless of what the etymology for that word is, who are al-Qissisin? So they're basically, al-Qissisin are basically the scholars. They're basically the monks, the ones that were designating themselves to worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or at least to, I guess, their what they considered as their God, whether it's Christ or whether it's a son of God, whether it's the Holy Spirit, etc. At the end, they were considered as part of that group. And later on, of course, these qissisin, so here, this is the point that I wanted to talk about. Okay. And later on, these qissisin, they basically, some of them had come to the Prophet ﷺ, heard the Prophet ﷺ and the Quran that he was reading, and they had accepted Islam. Okay, so let's see here, Al-Qurtubi, he said, وَلَفْظُ الْقِسِّيسِ, the actual word, لفظ القسيس, the actual wording of al-Qassis, he said it could possibly be Arabi, and that's why إما أن يكون عربيا, could possibly be Arabi, or it could possibly be a Latin word. So when we say Rumi here, Latin word, and it could be a combination of perhaps an Arabic influence that was also adopting from their language, and it became basically a word that was basically something that they would consider as part of their culture. This is what they would name it. They had no any other name, but originally it was adopted from a different word. So you could see, especially those that would live in another culture, you might actually speak maybe a particular language, and then those that probably moved to a different country, their Arabic, you could see it's influenced by the other language. So we could see, for example, the Arab that are living in the US, they would use already. They would literally use everybody. I don't know why they agreed that already is one of those vocabularies that must be used. We don't have, I don't know why they thought in Arabic we don't have already or okay. Why they they agreed on certain words and it became part of their vocabulary. Already, okay, in the ing, urkuding, akuling. So they would really shift the whole thing. I'm sure Kachi would also have the same problem. Am I right, Tahira, Sister Tahira? They would probably have the same problem. Some Kachis will probably agree on certain words that we gotta adopt this from the English language, and then it would become something that, hey, all the Kachis that probably lived in the U.S. have already adopted certain words, but the Kachis that are probably living in Pakistan or the Kachis that are probably living in Kenya, they might not actually use those words. And you could see this, adopting certain words coming in, I guess, because they're close in proximity with certain groups. Okay, let's see.
I agree.
Yeah, right. So let's see. When you're talking about il-Qassisin, of course, at the end, some of them, they basically Siddiqeen, Ruhbana, etc. So at the end, who really were these groups? What were their names? We don't really know much about their names and those groups. So at the end, we know that there were some groups that had come to the Prophet ﷺ from the Christians, whether from the Christians from the Levant or from Abyssinia, and they had basically had become Muslim, and the Quran documented their conversion in order for others to know of those people. So think of in Surah Yasin when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, وَجَاءَ رَجُلٌ مِّنْ أَقْصَى الْمَدِينَةِ يَسْعَى. A man comes. Was his name known? Was it mentioned? I mean, the Quran mentions so many different names. Why not mention this name? It's basically to let you know that the name doesn't matter. And even these Qassisin and Ruhban, the name doesn't matter. It's the actual embracement, the actual action is what matters. Let's see. Urwa ibn Zubayr. Who's Urwa ibn Zubayr? Urwa ibn Zubayr. Zubayr is basically Zubayr ibn al-Awwam. Who's al-Awwam? Remember? Al-Awwam ibn Khuwaylid. Who's al-Awwam ibn Khuwaylid? Khuwaylid, does that name Khuwaylid sound familiar? Yeah. Who does it sound familiar with? Khadija bint Khuwaylid. Okay. So wait a minute, then who's this person? I'm going to write down those names and I want you to pay attention to who this person really is. Okay, so we've got, this is Urwa. I'm going to write down the names, so pay attention. Urwa ibn Zubayr ibn al-Awwam ibn Khuwaylid. Okay, now I want you to just look at those. Okay, we're going to put it here so we can see it better. Okay, and the person, so this is Urwa ibn Zubayr, Zubayr ibn al-Awwam. He was basically, Zubayr ibn al-Awwam was basically, let's see, the Prophet, was he related to the Prophet ﷺ? Well, let's see, Khadija bint Khuwaylid. Khadija bint Khuwaylid. Okay, here we go. We're going to put her name right there. Okay, so Khadija bint Khuwaylid is Zubayr ibn al-Awwam ibn Khuwaylid. Khadija and al-Awwam were brothers, siblings. Okay, that was basically,
wow.
Yes. All right, that was her brother. Okay, and Zubayr was coming over to his aunt's house. Who she married to? The Prophet ﷺ. So when Zubayr had become Muslim, he was approximately 13 years old. So he would basically come over to his aunt's house, Khadija, and of course, Zubayr, all right, was actually, he wasn't, you're looking at Zubayr ibn al-Awwam was also married.
Was he the one who had the bird?
The bird?
Yes.
No.
That died? Zubayr?
What do you mean bird? What bird?
Uh,
مين عمير
sorry.
Oh, okay.
صح
Okay.
ولا.
I'm like, which
ما
word is she
دفع على
talking
انه
about?
غير
Yep, that's a no, that's a different Sahabi. Is um, Zubair was actually one of those young Muslims. And is Zubair, listen to this. Al-Awwam ibn Khuwaylid, okay, just keep this one in mind, was actually married to who? Safiya bint Abd al-Muttalib. Wait, who's that? The Prophet ﷺ's aunt, Safiya bint Abd al-Muttalib. You see how they're so interconnected? So is Zubair would be from one side, the Prophet ﷺ's cousin. From his well, because Safiya is the Prophet ﷺ, Safiya is the sister for the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ, not for the Prophet ﷺ, but for the Prophet ﷺ's father. So she is his paternal aunt. So Safiya bint Abd al-Muttalib, let's do this again. Safiya bint Abd al-Muttalib was married to Al-Awwam ibn Khuwaylid. Okay? Safiya is a Zubair ibn Zubair was actually his mother. Zubair, Safiya bint Abd al-Muttalib was his mother. All right? And Urwa ibn Zubair. Oh, by the way, Zubair was married to, who was Zubair married to?
أسمع
Asma. Exactly. He was married to Asma bint Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, the daughter of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. Look at that connection. Look at that connection. You're talking about a society of udama, a society of these magnificent people. So Urwa ibn Zubayr, where was he getting his information from? Was Urwa a Sahabi? No, Urwa wasn't a Sahabi. Urwa wasn't a Sahabi. Zubayr was. Urwa would come to his aunt Aisha.
Yeah.
He would come to his aunt Aisha to learn from her because, of course, hey, how is his aunt Aisha? Because Zubayr was married to Asma. Asma is Aisha's sister. Who's their father? Abu Bakr Siddiq. Whose father? Asma and Aisha. Okay, so Urwa would come to Sayyidah Aisha to learn. Let's see what he had said. He said the Christians had lost their connection with the Gospels and they had included or introduced things that were not intrinsically part of it. And they were four people that changed everything. Lucas, Marcus, Johannes, Maqbus. So I guess Arabizing Luke, Mark, John, Maqbus. What is Maqbus? Mark. No, wait a minute. That's Mark.
Matthew.
Matthews. There you go. Maqbus. You call them Maqbus. Okay, Matthews. Okay. وبقي قسيس على الحق وعلى الاستقامة. He said only one qassis. So now you could see that he regarded them not as disciples. So I guess the word qassis here was, I guess, translated as a disciple because Christians don't see these people as priests, but as disciples. And he said only one of those qassis / disciple in this context then, only one stayed on practicing truth and basically on truth, and whoever was on their path was the one to be considered as following, I guess, a better glimpse of the traces for Prophet Isa alayhi salam. So
I wonder, are those the Unitarians then?
What time when was this? Does it have a date on there?
It doesn't have a date on there, and you want to keep
You do find that one of the Gospels is different than the other ones.
I mean, can we necessarily the Barnabas, I guess, but we know that that the scholars, looking at the Gospel of Barnabas, the wording, the dating, even
no, I think it was I think
It
maybe it
was
was John.
later, it was
Or
not
can't
exact, it was
remember.
later written and it wasn't,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's not a canonized gospel, but at the end, are we going to say that this is what Islam says? Where did he get this information from? Was it the Prophet ﷺ, or was this his knowledge of, I don't know, his knowledge about Christianity? It more seems that this was his knowledge about Christianity, and I guess he learned it from somewhere, but we can't necessarily say that this is what Islam says, or
Yeah,
this
and
is
I wanted to
the
add,
Sayyidah Aisha said.
I'm so sorry. It's kind of in the context of what you said earlier. I have met Christians, they're Unitarians, and they don't believe in the Son of God.
Right.
So I was wondering if that's that lineage that you were referring to earlier.
So the Unitarians today are completely different than the Unitarians back then. Um, we definitely know that there are Unitarians today, and they have their own interpretation for the gospel and what they consider and how they interpret that. No, this isn't saying that he is a son of God, but that he's actually a prophet of God, and they don't, kind of like you have some Unitarians, or at least some Christians, like believe it or not, some of those uh what are they called? I forgot what they were called, but they're living away from the city. What are they called? Mennonites. Some of the Mennonites are also Unitarian.
Or
Some are,
Mormon? Mormons?
no, Mormons are not. No.
No,
The
no, no,
Mormons,
no.
no. They have a completely,
Is it Amish?
Amish.
some Amish, not all, because Amish are, well, they definitely have their interpretation and their complete disassociation, but not all the Amish would have necessarily, this uh, this Unitarian like. So no, it's not. They're not Unitarians. No, they are more of like the German and the Dutch religion, and the Dutch interpretation, and not necessarily Unitarian. But there are some Unitarians, but the Unitarians that we have today are different according to what we would see. One, we would see in the writings for different scholars writing about the Unitarians, whether we're speaking about Western resources or whether we're speaking about Arabi resources that wrote about the Unitarians. They basically are not the same of what we would have today, for a number of different reasons. I guess they didn't have this political support to support that interpretation for a very long time, and they basically had been eliminated. And I guess they too were influenced with different interpretations. So perhaps one main interpretation was that he is a prophet of God. That perhaps stayed, but the details for the Bible, you could see it was also going through the same corruption. I can get more information because my husband is specialized on that.
Sorry, my question was when, I mean, so it says that or when uh, or even Zubair said, and then
No, so no, Nora. It's not that so his name is Urwa ibn Zubayr. It doesn't mean that he had taken the information from Zubayr, and it doesn't mean that he had taken it from Sayyidah Aisha. You want to just keep in mind that Urwa ibn Zubayr said this, but we don't necessarily consider that as marfu'a, meaning we don't know whether he somehow traced this information back to the Prophet ﷺ. We have no records of that.
yeah.
So was that something that he had learned, personal information? And this is his, let's call it academic study, academic research somehow in different religions? Did he get it probably from some priest that probably, he had met and told him some things and some information. So we wouldn't necessarily regard this as a valid resource just because he had said that. Okay.
Okay. Jazakallah.
To meaning it's valid upon Urwa ibn Zubayr, but it's not necessarily where we would consider that this information is of the highest account that we would have, and therefore these priests or these disciples are the ones that changed the Bible. Where and who and how did this whole thing actually start about the Bible, and what do the Christians actually believe in regards to when the actual change, and what political changes, or is it religious changes or interpretations, and what really happened to the Bible? We don't really have much information about it, but we are basically here. These ayat are telling us that some qissisin, some priests, or some of those people that were devout Christians, they had come to the Prophet ﷺ and basically converted right before the Prophet ﷺ, when they had seen the Prophet ﷺ. And basically, this ayah was, I guess, reporting this event and keeping this event for many others to know, many others to replicate, many others to see, and many others to take as an inspiration. Same thing when we're talking about the Ruhban. Ruhban, when was the date of this tafsir was written? Are we talking about Urwa ibn Zubayr? The account of Urwa ibn Zubayr, we're talking about this book of Tafsir Qurtubi. So, al-Qurtubi was actually in the 7th century. Okay, so we're talking about, let's say right there, let me look at the actual date. He died 671 Hijriya. Okay, but you want to keep in mind that al-Qurtubi and what he had said about Urwa ibn Zubayr wasn't something that he was quoting upon Urwa ibn Zubayr from a direct relationship. He was basically mentioning those resources that he had come across, that's what Urwa ibn Zubayr had said. So let's just go back right there. I hope I didn't lose the page. Oh dear, where's the page? Okay. Oh dear, I went too fast, I guess. Let's see, we're going to guess 156. Okay, nope. Sorry about that, everybody. We've lost the page. We'll get there, inshallah. Don't worry. We'll get there somehow. Okay, we're going to get there. Hold on. We're going to jump in pages. 110. Here we go. Okay, here we go. All right, this is it. So when we're looking at Urwa ibn Zubayr and what he had quoted, so al-Qurtubi didn't quote it off of him. Let's just say the person that is al-Muhaqqiq, did he actually... He didn't find any records of where this was actually quoted from. So he just left it like that and didn't really say, well, here's the information and here's the resource for this. Okay, let's see. Ruhbana. What is ruhban? Ruhban is basically the plural of rahib. Okay, and the word itself, where is it coming from? Rahiballahu yarhabuhu. They were fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And al-rahbaniyya is celibacy, and it's basically designating oneself in, I guess, whether it's a temple or whether it's a church or a monastery. And Abu Ubaid said that you're talking about the ruhban would be the plural, and the one is a rahib, and at the end you could see that the Arab, similarly, where does this, some scholars wanted to Arabize the word, and they said it's basically coming from fear, or coming from the whole area of Rahbaniyya, or the area of celibacy. But then, of course, is this necessarily a Arabi word? Was this later Arabized? Allahu A'lam. We don't really know whether it was later Arabized or not, but, just keep in mind that that people would borrow words, borrow terminologies from other languages and it doesn't necessarily always have to follow the actual conjugation that's coming within, I guess, the grammar within that language. And of course, this ayah, regardless, this ayah was definitely praising those that had believed in the Prophet ﷺ and did not necessarily follow the path of the majority in denying the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so that's why the ayah said, وَأَنَّهُمْ لَا يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ, and that they would basically not have any arrogance, and therefore they would let the truth guide them and not their ego and not the populace and not the, I guess, the not the masses that may surround them, or perhaps the maybe the group that they are with probably dictate, or make them believe that they have to be within the parameters of their group to be considered as included. But they basically, وَأَنَّهُمْ لَا يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ, they did not have the arrogance, and they let the truth guide them and not the people, and certainly not their ego as well. So this is it, inshallah. We'll continue tomorrow. Oh, is it tomorrow? Yeah, it is. وإذا سمعوا ما أنزل إلى رسول ترى أعينهم تفيض من الدمع مما عرفوا من الحق. يقولوا, oh, actually tomorrow we're doing the pearls of the Prophet ﷺ. So tomorrow we won't be doing tafsir, because that's going to be too much on you to do the pearls and then do tafsir. That's definitely going to be too hectic on both of us. So inshallah, we'll continue, I guess, our tafsir 2 days from now. Okay. And we'll do the pearls tomorrow, the pearls of the Prophet ﷺ, because there's so much to say about the pearls. I was so excited the other day. So inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow, but sooner than now, because it's going to be, yes, it's going to be what 5 hours from now? Yes, it's going to be 4 or 5 hours from now. So 8 p.m. Minnesota time, and not too late on you. Okay, this is it. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. So happy to see